Good morning and welcome to the Labor and Employment Podcast, everyone. We're pleased to be here in our third season and our fourth episode, and my name is Lee Jacobs, and I'm being joined with my colleague, Rosemary Enright, to discuss what you need to know about the proper way to onboarding, and hence the title of our episode, Building Bridges, the Art of Employee Onboarding. But before we jump into it, good morning, Rosemary. How are you?
I'm great, Lee. How are you today on this? It's, of course, who knows when people are listening to this, but I have to tell you, it's a blustery day here in Buffalo.
I heard potentially snowy is the correct word, not necessarily maybe blustery.
Yes, well, I didn't want to say snowy because it's March 19th and everybody will say, of course, Rosemary. But we did have 65 degrees last week. But yeah, it's just, it's blowing around out there pretty good right now, but it's not sticking. So that's good.
That's a good thing.
Yes.
Down here in the city, it was a cold start this morning, but It is warming up and getting better as we move along.
Yeah.
I'm thrilled to be with you again to continue our discussions. I've truly enjoyed them. I've gotten some good feedback from some of our listeners, and I think we've got some good ones coming on here. And we're starting from the very beginning of the employee relationship here now, onboarding and the proper way to do it.
Hey, and Lee, could I interrupt you for a second?
Of course.
I just want to say to our listeners, we actually had a couple of listeners reach out to us after listening to the employee handbook discussion we had, Lee, and said, hey, could you help us out with this? So just want to let you know, we're always here to help. So don't, sit there and you're listening, pause, listen, trying to, look at your handbook and make updates or check, am I compliant? We're happy to help. So I just wanted to let you know, because you said we'd gotten some great feedback, Lee, and that is true. And as I said, we've had several people reach out and ask, could you help us? So I just thought I'd let them know.
Without a doubt, and the same is true with the onboarding process, because I found in my career, not just as a lawyer, but as a, human, since I was, my first job when I was 15 years old, really day one sets the tone for the employee relationship. And this is one of the few areas where as the employer, you have full control over what the first day, first week, and first month looks like. So do it right. There's the right way to do it, and then there's the legal way to do it. And we're going to hit on both of those things today. Also to keep in mind, onboarding and employee retention and employee training and hiring is expensive. So onboarding is effective onboarding is a way to minimize costs, retain your employees, and at the end of the day, have a better workforce and save you money. But before we do that, I think, as is now customary with our podcast, we should start off with a fun fact for the podcast. And for me, I actually have a relevant fun fact that's to onboarding. So my first job as a lawyer, not my first job as a shoe salesman when I was in high school, but as a lawyer graduating after I graduated law school, I showed up to the law firm on day one, said hi, went to the receptionist, said, I'm Lee Jacobs, I'm here for my first day. And the receptionist says, you're who, from where? And she has me sit down, and then the receptionist makes a phone call. And then about 10 minutes later, I later learn who was the director of HR, comes out, and she says to me again, you're who, from where now? And I said, yeah, I'm hi. Partner X hired me, and today's my first day. And she went, well, Partner X is in Florida. He didn't tell me anything. Why don't you just sit here while I figure it out? And my first day was sitting in a conference room doing nothing. And that kind of set the tone for the rest of my time that I was there. And so from a personal and a professional standpoint, I always encourage and try to tell people onboarding is the way to really set everything off on the right foot. I don't know if you've got an onboarding story, Rosemary, but I turned it over to you.
Well, first of all, I have to say that is quite the story. I can't imagine. I think I would have been like, this is not the place for me. I want balloons. I want you're here. But I'm going to go with an irrelevant story.
Love those too.
All right, I'm going to go irrelevant, but who knows? In the middle, I may all of a sudden think of something. But we were just out in LA over Oscar weekend, and we're lucky enough to go to one of the parties. And so I'm sure he is not listening to this podcast, but Lee, I have to give a shout out to Sterling K. Brown. So for our listeners, if you're not sure who he is an actor. He was on This Is Us. He played Randall on This Is Us. He's been in quite a few movies, but he was associated with the Oscars this year because he was in American Fiction, which was up for Best Picture with Jeffrey Wright. And he was I talked to him probably for about 10 minutes. And I just want to say, what a great guy. So it was interesting to talk to him. And if you've seen him in both, in This Is Us and in American Fiction, talk about range. I won't spend the time going on and on about that right now, but that's what he and I were talking about. And he was laughing and he said, I so appreciate you recognizing it. And I said, how could you not? You couldn't get two more different characters. But so shout out to you, Sterling, if by any chance you happen to listen to Barclay Damon's L&E podcast.
Well, we'll have to ask our media team to send him a link to this, or his team to get a link for this. But it's great to hear sometimes, when stars and celebrities turn out to be good people. You hear sometimes that they're just bad people.
Yeah.
That's such a good thing.
Yeah.
But so let's jump into it.
Yeah.
I think, and if you are a regular listener of ours, you're going to be hearing this theme from me over the next couple of episodes. So we're going to be talking about onboarding and investigations and offboarding, letting employees go. And before you, and this is where I come in, I want to say step 0, which is actually before step 1. You need to make sure before you're ready to do the onboarding, the offboarding, or the interview, the investigation, that all of your ducks are in a row. So like for me, that first law firm that I work for failed at step 0. There was no communication from the department to the HR that was supposed to do the onboarding. That one, a job is open, the job has been posted, it is an applicant has been applied, and we've hired them and now put them into payroll and get them ready for the whole system. That failed. And that's not necessarily a legal requirement, but there are legal problems if you don't do it right. And that's the first thing here, job descriptions. Job descriptions and job postings particularly can be very problematic if they're not correct. So for example, and Rosemary, I'll give one job description problem that I know of, and a job posting, problem that I know of, and I'll ask you if you know any. So I came across this office of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission in Boston, that all they sit and do is troll on LinkedIn and look for positions that say waitress or waiter, hostess or host, things, bus boy, positions that imply only a certain sex can do the job. And that job posting is per se, meaning automatically, in violation of the law. Because how can a girl be a bus boy? And as you all know, for my avid listeners here, my practice area of focus is in hospitality. So we had a change about 5 years ago in the industry where we went from bus boys to bussers. You're no longer hostesses and hosts, you are greeters. You're no longer waiters and waitresses, you're servers. So a job description, right? So if you have a rogue manager who's posting a job description or a job posting that does not coordinated with the business, it could be a problem. You have any thoughts on this, Rosemary?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, another one, Lee, that comes up a lot is recent graduates. All right. Recent graduates preferred. All right. And you may be sitting there thinking, well, why is that a problem? Well, if someone's a recent graduate, what comes to mind? They graduated from college. They're maybe 22, 23, 24. I mean, some people are on the 5-year and the 6-year plan, but
exactly.
But they're in that 22 to 24, 25, age range, right? And so we have actually handled some charges, Lee, in which a person who was over the age of 40 said, I can't look at this job application. They're clearly looking for younger applicants because I'm not a recent grad, right?
Yeah.
And so absolutely. And, the other thing, Lee, that has been quite interesting is, a lot of companies will conduct a criminal background check, right? Have to be very careful about whether or not that is in the job post and how you state it. So we have handled several charges of discrimination, saying that because of the way it was written in the job post about the background check and what was required. And the complainant said it had a chilling effect. I looked at it and I thought, well, clearly the organization isn't going to hire me. Right. And so never gave us the opportunity, never gave the employer the opportunity to even engage in the individualized assessment under Article 23A of the Corrections Law. But didn't matter. In fact, we were not successful with the charges. And so there are a lot of pitfalls. And in fact, Lee, as we're talking about this, we should think about maybe doing a session on job postings.
I think I have a feeling we're going to be saying that a lot during this podcast.
I think you're right.
During this episode, because here's another one, for example. In New York City, you have to now include a salary range in your job posting. And it needs to be a meaningful salary range. It can't be minimum wage to $500,000 a year. It has to be meaningful and real. So I think the key here is, as it comes to before your employee has even made an application to you, and we could do a whole episode on applications we were talking about earlier. Before someone has even applied and says, hi, I want the job, you could have already broken some laws and already been in violation. So here it's important, I think, before you even accept applications, make sure a job opening is valid, exists, and your posting is correct. And if you ultimately do a job description, that the job description is correct and right as well. And that's all things that we here can help you with. So please feel free to reach out. So before we now actually jump into the onboarding process, anything to add, Rosemary, before I give a slew of some crazy onboarding statistics?
No. Just let's hit it with the statistics that will rock all of your worlds.
So here are, I'm not going to give all of them. I have 16 statistics that I found from a Quiros 2024 study, but I'm going to give some of the ones that I thought were kind of really shocking here. The first is that 1 in 3 HR professionals reported that the quality of their onboarding program was not up to standard. So the people that are actually doing the onboarding program themselves, 1/3 of them felt that the program was insufficient. And that's a common theme that I've found in my practice, that 9 times out of 10, unless you are a Fortune 500 large business where you have professional, educated HR professionals, usually the person who's doing HR is a trusted family member, someone that's been in there since day one, that doesn't have the education or the experience, and they have just now fallen into the HR role. And they need support and they need help, and this number shows that. Another one here, 58% of organizations say that their onboarding program is focused on processes and paperwork. That's a question of whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing. Do you want to just have an employee on day one sit and fill out paperwork? Or do you want to have them have an orientation and understand what the business is, the culture, and how things work? Another focus here is 93% of businesses agree that onboarding can help new hires decide whether they want to stay. For me, I stayed at my first job. Rosemary, you would have walked away. And the last one that I want to give here is that a negative onboarding experience can make new hires 2 times as likely to look out for new jobs. So from day one, if you don't set off on the right foot, it can cause a problem. So first, there's a difference between onboarding and orientation. Orientation is a single event. That's that day where you walk in and you orient everyone to, here's the bathroom, here's the cafeteria. Think of your first day of school, right? Here's your orientation day. Whereas onboarding is a comprehensive process where you fulfill all of the legal requirements to make someone an employee, but then separate from that, you're making them a part of your team. You're making them part of your culture. You're folding them into your organization. Rosemary, what do you see in your career as you've helped clients? What do you see as the goals of onboarding? What do you advise people? What's the point? Why do we do this?
Well, yeah, I have to say, as I was listening to you say that, Lee, I thought to myself, I don't know that I could say it any better. I thought that was perfect the way you said it. I don't know that I could add anything to it. The only thing I would say is, when you were going through the stats and you said whatever the last one was with the process and the paperwork, one of the things I always say, even with the onboarding, which is, as you said, the legal and getting them, here's your IT password, here's your fob, here's all of this. The other thing is, you can't just make that rote, right? So I've looked at, personnel files when I'm responding to a charge, and I see that, the onboarding, because a lot of organizations have an onboarding checklist, right, Lee? You see it, and it says
Yep.
top, welcome, and then, their I-9 and their W-4 and the sexual harassment policy, and there's a list, and I'll just see just a line down it. So they've just went right down the line, and they have done it in like half an hour or something. That's not effective. All right. So yes, New York State and the federal government, require us to complete certain forms. But again, as Lee said, this is this person's first day. Think of your first day, like you said, at school, how nervous you are and you're trying to learn everything, and that if you're just getting a fire hose of information at you, none of that is setting in, right? It's not, and you're not absorbing it. So I'm not saying you have to drag it out forever, but it's also not just going through the motions and drawing the line down the onboarding. Okay, here, I just handed them everything and now I'm done. So
see, I actually create checklists for my clients for their onboarding process, but the last checklist item is incorporate into culture, like set meetings, assign a mentor, like because we're human beings, we make mistakes, so checklists help prevent that.
Yes.
So build it into the process.
That's right.
And I think that's part of one of an effective onboarding program is you actually have to plan it. You've got to create it. You have to think about it. It's not just, let me get your I-9, let me get your payroll. You're good. Go. You're good to work. No, it's more than that. Now, obviously, every business is different, and not every business needs a full-blown multi-week onboarding program and mentors, et cetera, et cetera. But you have to look internally and decide what you need. What's best for your business? How can you make your culture known and apparent to your new employees? How can you integrate your new employees into your culture? How do you foster jumbling of the word.
Yeah.
How do you make it an inclusive environment and foster that environment for everyone?
Well, and I'm going to interrupt you for a second, Lee, because I think the point for all of you, as you're saying there, listening, thinking, wait, I've got 20 employees, or I've got 50, or like you said, I'm the HR person who is the relative. I don't have the time to do all of that. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Lee, what we're getting at here is at least think about it. Think about what is important and know that. So yes, so those of you who have looked me up on our firm website, you can see I was with Oracle for 16 years. Okay. The way Oracle is going to onboard people is going to be wildly different than some small manufacturer, in, Albany or something like that. But at least think about it. Think about, as you said, Lee, how do I, or how do we, incorporate, like you said, incorporate the culture and this person, so they walk out feeling, you know what, this is the right place for me. Oh, and by the way, I understand I may not have read the 50-page handbook, but I at least have it, or I know who I go to, and so on. So sorry to interrupt you, but
no, please, and that brings to the next point. Like you, as I see it, you have to, when you're doing this internal self-assessment of what works best for you. Oracle, I'm going to assume, had a very formal and rigid onboarding program.
Yeah, absolutely.
And whereas for my first job as a shoe salesman in high school, wasn't a very informal program. and it worked, right? You need to have the program that works and matches what you have, because imagine you're a 10-person coffee shop. Having a formal 2-week onboarding program does not make sense. But maybe it does make sense to have, the manager spend an hour or two with that employee on the first day, going over the handbook, going over the policies and procedures. You really need to figure out what works best for your own business. And as Rosemary, I think you said, think about it. Just think about it.
So Lee, before we move on to the next little section here, as we're talking about the onboarding, again, not at all saying, we should have a multi-day, session. It's what works for your organization. But would you agree, Lee, that onboarding, the onboarding and how successful or how well we do that could come up 6 months or a year or 2 years later when we're dealing with a wrongful termination and somebody is commenting on how they were or were not onboarded?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Like the problems that will, well, as is with so much in labor and employment, things aren't a problem until they are a problem. But the problems will begin literally on, as we talked about with the job descriptions, maybe on day 0. But 9 times out of 10 with individual employees, I agree with you, they start on day 1.
Mm-hmm.
So, not even the, discrimination and harassment where you didn't give the policies, you didn't give the complaint form, things we're going to be talking about here that you're required to do. And we talked about in our prior episodes. But if you don't onboard properly, like, for example, give a proper wage acknowledgement form, and we're going to be talking about that today, you start accruing a $50 per day penalty that begins on day 1. And you can't go back and fix it. You can't go back and backdate it. You can't fix the mistake. It just happens and it's there. And that penalty accrues daily up to day 100 to $5,000 per employee. And odds are, if you're making a mistake with one employee, you're probably making it with all of your employees.
Right.
So start right on day 1.
Exactly.
You're 100% correct, Rosemary.
Because doggone well, Lee, it's going to come up. Well, on the right out of the gates, they did this wrong, or they didn't do this, or they didn't tell me that. And as you said, you can't recover. What's done is done. It's so easy to do it right from the beginning.
It is. And I have found that most people know what the right thing is, the right conclusion. It's the process to get you to the right conclusion, and let us help you make sure you're doing that right process. Here's a question for you, Rosemary. Where do you advise clients as to where they're onboarding documents, right? So now we haven't hit on them yet, but we will, and because we're here in the planning, the process phase. Where should their documents live? They filled out their I-9s, the W-4s, the emergency contact information, all of the documents that they sat there and filled out in the paperwork. Where do you advise clients they should live those documents?
I was trying to come up with a wise answer, but I couldn't. But I do have to say, I think that's kind of a trick question, isn't it, Lee? Because there's all different forms reside in different places. Right. And so, for example, all the I-9 paperwork, I'm going to keep in a separate file. I'm going to advise my clients you have a separate file where you keep all your I-9s. Some keep it in the personnel files. I have them keep it separately. Their W-4, all their tax forms and their emergency contact. You may disagree, Lee, but I'm going to keep that in a personnel file. All right. I suppose one could make the argument that you put the contact information, in a medical file, but it may not be something related to medical. So I like it in the personnel file. But depending on what we're talking about, there are different places that I would have them store them. But the bottom line is, they're secure wherever they are. So it doesn't matter if they're, if they're in a file cabinet. And true story. I was on site with the EEOC, and where they were doing investigative interviews, they came into the HR office, and the investigator was sitting there looking, and there was a wall of all the file cabinets where everything was stored. But guess what? None of them locked.
Oh. That's a problem.
Of course. And the investigator looked and said, "Do those lock?" And and innocently, before I could stop my client, they said, "Well, no." And bam. we were
Yep.
dead in the water out of the gates. So if it's in a file cabinet, all right, if the file cabinets have to lock. And again, and actually what's interesting too is they also had the medical files right with the personnel files, so right behind it. No, put it in a separate cabinet or a separate drawer that again locks. And oh, by the way, the room has to lock, where the locked file cabinets are. What were you going to say, Lee?
I was going to say, my question to you is, do you have a feeling between paper versus electronic documents and saving things? But before you answer, I'll let you ruminate on that. And the way that I tell people that if you're going to do paper records, they need to be inside a locked room that few people have keys to, and then inside a file cabinet that even less people have keys to.
Exactly.
Because
which is what I was just talking about with the EEOC, right?
Yeah. And the same concept applies to your electronic, whether you be electronic or not. I want to hear your thoughts on that. Same concept. You can't share it with everyone. It's on a need to know basis. Yeah. It's electronic. But do you like electronic HR records, personnel files?
All right. Well, full disclosure, when I am engaged in litigation, I like paper. I will admit it. I'm old school that way. I want to be able to sit and look at it and flip through it and read it and mark it and make, all of that. But at this point, I also like trees and the forest. Now I'm being a wise guy there, but no, I'm leaning more toward electronic now.
Sorry to depose you or cross you a little bit. Right. But by electronic, do you mean like where I'm using an HRIS through my PEO, where I'm filling out a electronic form of like my emergency contact sheet, or I have a paper copy and then that paper copy is scanned and saved?
Yeah. All right. Well,
what are your thoughts?
See, that's just an old school preference thing. So here, but you know what? Actually, what I'll say to that is, I like paper and scanning, but often that's hard to read, right? The writing and all of that. So I don't know. I guess I'm starting to lean toward, as you just said, some system where they're typing everything in. What about you? I'd be curious to hear.
I have no preference.
Yeah.
But my preference is, if you have it, keep it. And there are no excuses anymore, right? Yeah. So I had, after Hurricane Sandy, I had a client whose time clock records, he had like Fred Flintstone, punch clock records, 6 years worth of records in the basement of his house that washed away in Hurricane Sandy. We literally had a video of the records being washed away in Hurricane Sandy. And it was, the ALJ said, too bad, so sad. It's 2016. Dear listeners, it's 2024. There is no excuse, in my opinion, if you want to do paper, there's no excuse to have a paper backup. And conversely, if you have electronic records, there's no excuse for you to have a backup of those electronic records. Yeah. We have a client of the firm, Rosemary, that I had a problem with their PEO, who was deleting their HR records and their former PEO, their former payroll company, who was deleting on a daily basis records so today is March 19th, 2024. On March 18th, 2017, erased. Tomorrow, March 19th, 2017, erased. Daily, each day it gets erased. And the records that we need are now gone because something wasn't a problem until it was a problem. Right. So when you leave your PEO, your payroll company, your outsourced HR, you leave Google, you leave Dropbox, whatever it is, take a backup with you. It's 2024. There are no excuses.
It's true. I love that. I love that there are no excuses, but you're absolutely right. And I actually had a client, same thing. The records were destroyed in a fire. And we ended up with a discrimination charge, and the EEOC asked for specific records. We couldn't produce them. Fast forward 10 years, and what was it? over $1 million in damages awarded to the complainant.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow. Yeah, like it, and the if you all haven't figured it out, you as the employer must have the
Yeah.
records. And there are few, if any, exceptions or excuses that will be accepted by anybody.
Except maybe the
Okay.
dog ate it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Maybe.
Maybe. You got to get a friendly
That's
investigator,
right.
a friendly auditor who's a dog
That's
lover,
right.
perhaps.
Yeah.
So I think, Rosemary, we should breeze through this next concept that I put together here.
Okay.
Onboarding best practices,
Yep.
right? So think about, we advise, again, haven't really spoken about legal things here. These are best practices to make, best business decisions, but make your people feel welcome. Make their, announcements that people are prepared for a warm reception. Plan if you can, depending upon your business. Again, look internally what works for you. Coordinate with supervisors, set up schedules so they can meet with people. Think about the first day and the first week, training and development. Should you assign a mentor to this employee? Just take a moment and think about it. Do you have any thoughts on these concepts, Rosemary?
No, I'd agree with you. And I have to say, I think our firm does a great job of this. I mean, Lee, you
Yeah.
were a part of it. I mean, Ree is a fairly recent addition to our firm. And I mean, how many days? I mean, there was a whole set schedule.
It wasn't a daily schedule for 2 weeks, but I had appointments going through the first 2 weeks of my time here with people from different groups, making sure I was trained and onboarding. And you used the phrase earlier, Rosemary, about like a water hose. It felt like drinking from a water hose at some point, a fire hose at some points. But it did show, the experience just from me, from my first employment, where you're who from where now, to I showed up on my desk with my personalized schedule with appointments through the next 2 weeks. Like, wow, these people actually think about me. They care about me, and they want to make sure I'm incorporated into the culture, into the firm. Makes a big difference.
It does. It really does.
Very, very big difference. And before we jump into the minutia of it, the last thing that I want to talk about, the minutia of your onboarding, the last thing I want to talk about is that we always need to consistently think about ways to improve and make it better. So check with your people that are doing the onboarding. What support do they need? Check with people who have been recently onboarded. How can the program be better? How can it be made and improved? And most importantly, set up time to audit the processes, because we are human beings and we can make mistakes. So you can have a new person who's doing your onboarding that forgot to do X for everybody. Rather than learning about it 6 years later when you're served with a lawsuit, perhaps maybe you learn about it in every 6 months when you do a audit of the people that you've been onboarded, so you can perhaps go back and not necessarily fix the mistake, but stop the bleeding from continuing to happen.
There's a visual for you. Stop the bleeding.
Yeah,
I always say stop the hemorrhaging.
Yeah, like there's for so many of my clients that wind up either in lawsuits or the DOL audits, and we're not talking discrimination or harassment. We're talking about whether or not they've been paid right.
Yeah.
It's usually death by 1,000 cuts. It's not that I didn't pay you the $50,000 check. It's I didn't pay you $1 a day over the last 6 years. And then the fines and the penalties add up, and it becomes a problem. Last topic here, Rosemary. Special considerations. How do, in this post-pandemic world, onboarding remote employees? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, so I have some employers who are clients who are larger, and they can travel somebody, right? Travel them if you say remote, like I've got several clients right now who are based in New York, but they're letting people work anywhere now, right? So they've got people in Texas and Nebraska and Florida and Alabama and all over. And in some instances, they will fly them to one of their major offices or their headquarters to onboard those individuals. Others, unfortunately, they're doing it via Zoom or Teams. But when you do the onboarding with those individuals, it should be the same. right? The same documents, the same process that you're following, you're just figuring out a different way to do it. As I said, maybe it's on Zoom, maybe it's a telephone call, maybe it's them traveling to an office that's close to them. But at the end of the day, they need to be, incorporated into the culture and welcomed and onboarded just like everybody else. And realize there are some laws that come into effect here. So again, there's another episode, Lee, remote employees, because you think about it, like in New York now, all of your posters, right? So all of our state and federal wage and hour and your anti-discrimination and harassment, all of those have to be available electronically. Right. So now you've got, and so you've got to set up your remote employees with access to that. So, I mean, it can seem like a lot, but if you have a prescribed onboarding process, like Lee said, you've got your checklist, then you just figure out which of these are done and in this way on Teams or on the call or bring them in. And, and like you said, hello, it's 2024. A lot of this stuff can be sent electronically.
And I think to have another personal story and to toot Barclay Damon's horn, as our listeners know or don't know, we have a platform that ranges through the entire Northeast and then into Canada, from Boston down to Washington, from New York City up to Buffalo, through Albany, and following the Erie Canal, heading up Rochester and Syracuse. So I'm based in New York. Rosemary's in Buffalo. I'm in New York City. Rosemary's in Buffalo. So one can say I am a remote employee. And I did have those 2 weeks of my orientation, my onboarding at the beginning. I had meetings scheduled via Zoom with people in different offices. It was made a thought process here of the firm to incorporate people regardless of where they are. And even though I'm a remote employee. So it can be done. It's 2024. It really can be done. What about high-level employees, Rosemary? So a business that's onboarding or bringing on their new president and CEO, a high-level executive, do they need to go through this process as well? This minutia that we've been talking about and we will soon be talking about?
I say yes. Lee. What do you say?
Absolutely. For a couple of reasons. First, they're your actual employee. Yep. So the legal requirements apply to them as well. But, if they're going to be overseeing an organization or they're a high level manager or department, whatever it may be, they should know what their employees go through.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Lee. Exactly. Yeah.
They should absolutely know. And what if there's a message that's being said in onboarding that they want changed? They'll never know that information until they actually engage in the onboarding process. And I think, Rosemary, and dear listeners, please apologize with us. I think, we're going to probably break this episode into two pieces. And this is going to be our first episode talking about the goals and thought processes behind the onboarding, and the minutia of the onboarding will be our next episode, which we will we'll post very shortly after this one. So the last topic, I think, here of special considerations, Rosemary, employees requiring accommodations. This is one that is I've found to be not problematic, but something of takes time and understanding. And depending upon whether you are a professional HR person or that family member that's now doing it for the family business. Because sometimes we don't know an employee needs an accommodation until they actually have started on day one, or we're in week 2, or whatever it may be. What are your thoughts on this, Rosemary?
Well, if I understand what you're posing to me, what I'd say is, you're gonna engage in an interactive process, just like you do an employee who's worked for you for 6 years or 10 years or 20 years, and something changes, right? Something changes and they now need an accommodation. And so the key for me is you engage in good faith with that individual to determine what, if any, restrictions they have and what, if any, reasonable accommodations we can make to ensure they can perform the essential functions of the job. And you always just focus on the job, right? And what they can and what they can and cannot do, and the essential functions, and how do we make it so you can perform those. So to me, it's the fact that they're a new person that I'm onboarding is no different than, as I said, someone who's been with us for years. It's a good faith interactive process with them. I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Well, I think that's right. No matter what, it has to be the good faith interactive process. And here to toot Barclay Damon's horn again, right? I had as part of my onboarding process an ergonomics review, and so for those that don't know what that means,
I did not know we did that.
To make sure that when you're sitting at the desk, everything's comfortable and et cetera, et cetera. You can't tell this, but I'm 6'4", and the desk that I originally had in my office was way too low, and I could not roll underneath it. I wouldn't necessarily call that a disability accommodation, but I needed an accommodation. And Barclay Damon found that out because of its thorough onboarding process, without actually having to come up and say to me, Lee, do you have a disability? Do you need anything? Do you need any help? Which in and of itself could be problematic. So if you think about it with your team, when you're making these planning processes, you can get to the root of the problems you're trying to solve without actually asking the outright question. And again, these are all things we can help you with.
Well, and again, and it's as simple as, like you said, somebody might have recognized because you're so tall. But the other thing is, often once someone has been made a conditional offer of employment, you can sit down. Here's the job description. We talked about that. Let's go through it. While you're not out there on the floor doing the job, you're looking through this. Do you understand what these duties are and these responsibilities and these functions? And do you think you can perform all of those? Right. And so that's when something like this would come up, Lee, right? Somebody might look and say, oh, you know what? This particular function might be a challenge for me. Okay, well, let's talk about that, And
I think that is probably a good ending place, because that will lead very well into part 2 of our episode of Building Bridges, the Art of Employee Onboarding. And dear listeners, we thank you for listening. As always, we'd love to hear from you about your thoughts. And we have a specific question for those of you that are listening to us on Spotify. And this was a question that I posed to Rosemary, and we're curious to hear what you think. Where does your onboarding paperwork live? And you'll see in the various choices that will be posted up on Spotify, whether or not you have any onboarding paperwork, whether it's paper in a file cabinet, electronically in the cloud, or it lives with a third party like your payroll company or PEO. Because you need to think about that. Because at the end of the day, your documents are the things that are going to save you when you try to recreate what happened 3, 6, 7 years ago. So know where your documents are, protect them, keep them secure, and keep them safe. And until our next episode, we thank you for listening. And before I conclude and hit the end button, Rosemary, do you have any final thoughts? Any final things you'd like to impart to our listeners?
No, I think we've taken up enough of their time for now. So I'll hold till the next episode. All right.
Okay. Perfect. All right. Thanks, everybody.
The Labor and Employment Podcast is available on barclaydamon.com, YouTube, and all your favorite podcast streaming platforms. Like, follow, share, and continue to listen. Thanks.